Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that your life savings, enough yesterday to buy a house, are suddenly gone, and you're faced with the reality that you can only afford a single loaf of bread with it. Imagine your monthly salary remaining in your hand like a bird. Imagine people carrying cash in shopping carts instead of wallets. When you accept the fact that these things are not a dystopian fantasy, its name is hyperinflation, and believe me, this has repeated itself countless times throughout history. We accept money as something regular, something we can always rely on. But if we dig into history a little, we see one clear thing. History shows us the truth, which is the opposite situation. The bad thing is that hyperinflations didn't just wipe out bank accounts. They also destroyed governments, families, and empires. They burned through societies like financial fires and exposed how fragile our established monetary systems are. Now, you will see how 5 countries, 5 real economies, watch their currencies turn to ash, and how this ruined their lives. Pay attention to this while watching. Inflation is not always loud, especially not at first. It slowly creeps into our lives, at first like a wicked whisper, and when people notice, there is no salvation left. Our first country is Germany, the year 1923, the Weimar Republic. After World War I, Germany was drowning in debt. With the Treaty of Versailles, the country was burdened with reparations exceeding 132 billion gold marks, an astronomical amount of debt that would be difficult to pay and would last for generations. What did the German governments do as a result? They printed millions of marks. Although it seemed quite manageable at the beginning, prices then doubled, then they tripled, quintupled, and suddenly exploded. By November 1923, the German mark had become so worthless that a loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. Of course, alongside this devaluation, it peaked with people burning cash for warmth. Children were even using the money as a plaything. The middle-class family structure witnessed their lifelong savings evaporate within weeks, and the result was deep damage and a societal collapse. It wasn't just the economy and money that collapsed. Trust was gone. When a people lose faith in the value of their currency, everything is ruined. Your trade, your contracts, your savings, your salaries, everything becomes meaningless. This economic collapse brings about the collapse of social life. It prepares the ground for extremist political structures and creates desperation and chaos. Yes, at the end of this process, just 10 years later, Adolf Hitler and his radical party seized power, and the result of this economic trauma would become the result of this inflation monster. Our second country is Zimbabwe. In the early 2000s, President Robert Mugabe's government faced sanctions from around the world and economic isolation, and they were forced to initiate very large land confiscations that ruined agricultural productivity. The result here would not change. The government chose to respond, which is not difficult to guess, by using the printing press again. As a result, an economic spiral began. By 2008, they were left alone with the fact that Zimbabwe's inflation rate was 79.6%. Note, the previous text stated 79.6 billion, but the current text states 79.6%. I will translate the text as provided. Prices were doubling every single day. The government was constantly forced to add zeros to the currency, so much so that they printed 10 million, 100 billion, $100 trillion bills, taking measures they thought were effective. They eventually had to give up and were forced to switch to foreign currencies like the US dollar and the South African rand instead of their own money. What do you think the cost of this would be? Not just the numbers on paper. Hyperinflation destroyed pensions, completely collapsed industries, and created a generation of economic refugees. Real wealth, land, skills, physical assets was the only thing that survived. Our third country is the Hungarian economic blow. 1946, the worst economic state in all recorded history. This case in the world of economics would often be called the worst, the giant collapse, hyperinflation in recorded history. After World War II, the economy of the Hungarian country was shattered. The government in turn issued a currency called the pengo for war debts and reconstruction, and began printing this money at an insanely high speed without accountability. At its peak, prices were doubling every 15 hours. The inflation rate had already reached 41.9 quadrillion %. This meant 4 followed by 16 zeros. Their money had become so worthless that the government finally issued the milpengo, worth 1 million pengo, then the bipengo, worth 1 billion pengo. When these weren't enough, the Hungarian government eventually abandoned their currency and had to start over with the foreign. So what did this cost the Hungarians? They lost everything. Hungary's middle class was gone. Savings accounts were wiped out. The government had lost its remaining legitimacy. Hyperinflation had not only reset the economy, but had also erased their past. Our fourth country is Venezuela, the 2010s recent history. A country rich in oil, rich in resources, yet politically hit rock bottom. Years of corruption, price control attempts, the ambition of nationalizations, and reckless monetary economic management caused one of the region's wealthiest countries to turn into a cautionary tale of collapse. What did the government do to cover deficits in almost all areas? Strengthen failed programs and seize control? Of course, it printed money. And again, inflation erupted. In 2018, Venezuela's inflation rate would exceed 1 million%. Imagine having to spend your paycheck the day you earn it before it loses half its value. Supermarkets suddenly stood empty, barter returned. Doctors and engineers were forced to flee abroad to work as unskilled laborers. Just like in Zimbabwe, the government was constantly putting zeros on the banknotes, and although they tried to give up and slash 6 zeros off the currency, they couldn't undo the damage. Hyperinflation had ruined yet another country, collapsing its healthcare system and forcing millions of citizens to migrate. Of course, those who survived were those with physical assets or access to dollars. The others simply tried to survive as a snack for hyperinflation. Our fifth country is Yugoslavia, the 1990s, dissolution, accompanied by war now. Our next country is a less-known economy, Yugoslavia, the 1990s. Following the dissolution of the Soviet bloc and the violent disintegration of the country, Yugoslavia's economy collapsed under the weight of the war's aftermath, the monster of sanctions and poor country management. In Yugoslavia, inflation reached 313 million% per month in 1993. Prices were doubling every 1.5 days. To try to stabilize the situation, the government, like the others, issued new currencies, each time wiping out old savings. Citizens, besides trying to hold on to life, were using German marks and US dollars on the side. The official currency units had turned into a joke. They had become material useful only for lighting cigarettes or wallpapering abandoned shops. A recurring cycle and today's risks. And in all these stories, the same monetary cycle repeats. When a government faces a crisis, it prints money, trust is gone, the currency loses value, and society is torn apart. Look, it happened repeatedly. Different countries, different years, the same result. Yes, you might be saying now, this is just history being told. We are smarter societies now. We must have learned lessons. Do you think we really learned lessons from what we've experienced? Looking at today, global debt levels are breaking records. Even the United States alone has over $34 trillion in national debt, and this is constantly increasing. All the central banks around the world have printed trillions of dollars over the last decade to keep national economies afloat, push interest rates down, and stimulate markets. And although this seemed to work for a while, inflation was at low levels. Growth naturally continued. The system held on for a little longer, until it couldn't. In 2021 and 2022, something fundamentally changed. After years of sustained low inflation, prices started peaking rapidly. Supply chains broke, the war in Ukraine, energy spikes, and yes, trillions in newly printed money finally caught up with economies. All central banks suddenly moved to the stage of panic from printing. Interest rates were raised aggressively and sharp, markets wobbled, and ordinary people who didn't benefit from the cheap money boom began to feel the pinch deeply. Rents skyrocketed, food prices climbed, wages just couldn't keep up, and for the first time in decades, people began asking the same difficult questions again. What is money? Who controls this money? What happens to us when trust is broken? We are not at the edge of hyperinflation yet, but the warning signs show it, not just with prices, but in minds too. Also in the idea that printing money can solve structural problems. Also in the idea that we can borrow forever. Also in the idea that central bank will always save us. These are dangerous footsteps. Actually, the same ones taken in Weimar Germany, Zimbabwe, Venezuela. The difference now is the scale it will create, because never before has the entire global economy been so interconnected, so debt-driven, and so dependent on central bank intervention. If trust breaks now, it might not just be one country. It could be international and systemic. What can we learn return. Ways to protect against inflation. This brings us all to one point. Yes, perhaps we cannot control our Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank, but we can take control of our risk position, our savings, our habits, and our mindset. At this point, what lessons can we draw from this bad inflation? First, real wealth is not paper money. It is our purchasing power. It is our lands, our skills, our physical assets, our useful network, and our personal resilience. In each of these nations, printed wealth evaporated, but those who had tangible assets or could produce value outside the financial system were able to stand. Second, trust is everything. Currencies don't collapse because they are printed with ink. They collapse because our belief in the entire existence of social life collapses. When people stop believing that the money in their hand has value, the game is over. This belief can erode faster than most people imagine, and once it is gone, it is almost impossible to rebuild, like a glass breaking. Third, the inflation monster punishes the unprepared. It moves so fast, it comes sudden, and it hits those living on wages first. States can inflate away their debt, but you cannot deflate your grocery expenses with inflation. For this reason, financial education is not just useful for growing your wealth, it is also about protecting it. Well, how can we achieve this today? Instead of blindly trusting systems, try to understand them. Reduce unnecessary exposure to debt. We can do this by diversifying our assets, not just among stocks, but across systems. Maybe this means being somewhat conservative. Maybe it means learning a skill that doesn't lose value no matter what happens in the market. Maybe it means building a life that is simpler and costs less to sustain. Most importantly, it is necessary to remember that inflation is a hidden tax, a kind of financial theft, a slow erosion of your financial freedom. If you don't take precautions against it, the result will not change. The 5 worst hyperinflations in history were not random events. Someone caused them, due to bad policies, due to war, due to arrogant people, and because of the aimless, seductive lie that money can be created without consequence. I think you realize it again, don't you? You understand the cycle, and the next time someone utters the phrase, "This would never happen in this country," you will know exactly how to respond. History will not repeat itself, but if you don't understand it, the future will crush you all the same. If this video has given you a new perspective, hit the subscribe button. The answers are hidden in the dusty pages of history. I will show you where to look.